Okay, let me just share screen. Um, oof. Okay, yeah, hang on. I'm just going to sort of quickly exit this meeting and join it via my Firefox browser. I think I need to enable permissions. Yeah, just give me a minute, and I'll get back. Yeah, sorry. I hope this works out better. Hold on a minute. All sorts of problem I'm having technically. Okay. Hold on. Huh? Yeah, is this visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. My God. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So these are just excerpts, and I thought might help us to, since I doubt any of you is going to be reading this whole thing. These are excerpts from the preface, right? From Defoe's preface to Moll Flanders, and this is what he says: "The world is so taken up of late with novels and romances that it will be hard for a private history to be taken for genuine, where the names and other circumstances of the person are concealed, and on this account, we must be content to leave the reader to pass his own opinion upon the ensuing sheet and take it just as he pleases. The author is here supposed to be writing her own history, and in the very beginning of her account, she gives the reasons why she thinks fit to conceal her true name, after which there is no occasion to say any more about that." Yeah, so notice how this is all being couched and how this is being offered to us. Yeah, it's true that the original of the story is put into new words, and the style of the famous lady we here speak of is a little altered. Particularly, she's made to tell her own tale in modester words than she told it at first, the copy which first came to hand having been written in language more like one still in Newgate than one grown penitent and humble, as she afterwards pretends to be. Yeah. So, what are the claims that Defoe's making? One, he says, look, the world is sort of, it's like, takes us back to our discussion of Don Quixote, for instance, right? So, the world is sort of totally sort of taken up with novels and romances, and then he says, look, for a private history to be taken for real, right? We'll have to, of course, conceal the names and circumstances. And he says there are reasons why we need to do this. And then on the other hand, he says, look, it's up to the reader. We must be happy to leave the reader to it. The reader must then, make up his own mind upon what follows. And then he makes the claim that the author is that Moll Flanders herself is the author, and it's an autobiography. The author is supposed to be writing her own history. He doesn't use the word autobiography; he uses the word history, personal history, really. Yeah, and he says how in the beginning of the account she gives various reasons about why she thinks fit to conceal her true name. There are reasons why she doesn't want to tell us her true name, because if she's identified, it's just there's just too many it's very tricky. Her story itself is so involved, and it involves a whole lot of other people, so she can't possibly write an autobiography under her own name, right? So it has to be a sort of uh, she has to conceal the name, right? And then he also adds that if you actually this is also, it's not the story as it was written originally by Moll Flanders. This is something I've taken up and I've altered it a little bit because we had to use sort of more modest words, and that's really important. So there is also somewhere he talks about some kind of censorship, or that in a sense. Yeah. So the pen employed in finishing her story and making it what you now see it, what you see it to be, has had no little difficulty to put it into a dress fit to be seen. Yeah, notice the moral language in which it is, the language of morality in which all this comes to us, and to make it speak a language fit to be read. When a woman debauched from her youth, nay, even being the offspring of debauchery and vice, comes to give an account of all her vicious practices, and even to descend to the particular occasions and circumstances by which she ran through in threescore years, an author must be hard put to wrap it up so clean as not to give room, especially for vicious readers, to turn it to his disadvantage. Yeah, here is Defoe trying to take care of his own skin very clearly, right? He's telling us, look, here, I mean, firstly, this is Moll Flanders writing her own story as it is, but of course, I've had to make alterations to the language and blah blah blah, and it has to be sort of dressed in language that's fit to be seen. Yeah, and he also says that here you have a woman who's sort of really debauched, right? She runs through many husbands, she has many affairs, she's a thief at some point, and all of that, right? So it's a life of debauchery and vice. Yeah, pretty much it runs against all Protestant morality and ethics and so on, right? So, but I've made her this heroine, but there's certain things I've cleaned up. I've had to clean up about the text, right, in terms of language and so on. So he says so he has to sort of make that morality claim, right? That claim to this being a clean text, despite the sort of person that the heroine is, the sort of person that the writer is actually. Yeah. So he says all possible care, however, has been taken to give no lewd ideas, right? So I don't want to, sort of have my reader straying and so on. But so it's a very very clean text. No immodest turns in the new dressing up of the story. No, not to the worst parts of her expressions. To this purpose, some of the vicious part of her life, which could not be modestly told, is quite left out. Yeah, and several other parts are very much shortened. What is left, it is hoped, will not offend the chastest reader and the modestest hearer. And as the best use is made even of the worst story, the moral, it is hoped, will keep the reader serious. Yeah. So this is the crux of it. He says, look, it's a bad story. It's a story about a bad woman, therefore it's a bad story. But I'm hoping, firstly, because the language has all been cleaned up and so on, and secondly, the moral, there is a moral to the story, right? Also, at the end of it all, Moll Flanders, this debauched woman, is actually repentant. She repents for her sins. Yeah. So all those, insanely exciting adventures that she has are all sort of like, now she's looking back on all of it, and she's sort of really embarrassed about it. She's actually very apologetic about it. She repents all her past sins, literally. Yeah. So he says this is the moral, and I'm hoping that the moral will make up for the fact that this is a story about a bad woman. So therefore, it's in some ways a bad story. Yeah. To give the history of a wicked life repented of necessarily requires that the wicked part should be made as wicked as the real history of it will bear to illustrate, and give a beauty to the penitent part, which is certainly the best and brightest if related with equal spirit and life. Yeah. So keep this in mind. This is the way he frames this whole thing, and this is the way he justifies offering to his readers, a text that is based on the life of a woman who really cares two hoots for morality, right? From beginning to end, right up to the time when she turns 70, at which point she begins to repent, and it's sort of very hastily, plotted, I think, that repentance part, if you look at the text. But the most interesting, and the reason I think all of us will, or anybody would want to read Moll Flanders, is because of all the masala in the earlier parts, right? It's really like a Bollywood film, if you think about it. It's sort of, she runs through one husband after the other, and making it a really proto-feminist text in many ways. Yeah, Moll doesn't give a damn. I mean, she's like not embarrassed. She's not for a long time, right? Only towards the end for Defoe. So he wants to make it all convenient and neat and wrap it up and make it a good story, and a morally rich story, a satisfying story. He has her repent, right? And of course, all this is as though Moll is writing her own story. Yeah. Any questions or comments till now? All this is still from the preface. Okay, so anyway, you can always come back to this. So Defoe is, playing, obviously he's playing a double game. He's playing to the gallery, right? And also at the same time, so the gallery of like people who just want to take vicarious pleasure in reading about a woman who lives the kind of life maybe that they can't ever hope to lead. Yeah, she seems to be having a good time, and as I said, really doesn't care, right? So he's playing to the gallery, and at the same time he's playing to the moral sensibilities of the middle class. Yeah, so he's playing a bit of a double game here, and he's also got to keep an eye out on the elite and the literary establishment. So yeah, so he blames the character Moll herself, who is telling the story, for the bad or the dirty bits, right? And he treads carefully, and he says all possible care has been taken to give no lewd ideas. And he claims to have censored some bits that could not be modestly told. Yeah. So in that way, critics have argued that Defoe is really the ultimate tease. I mean, he's just a tease, really. Yeah. So the novel is sort of voyeuristic. Defoe evokes horror, envy, censure, judgment, and perhaps a whole range of other emotions in his very puritanical readers, and all this ties up really to the contemporary question of censorship, self-censorship, and what that all means. Yeah, so it's not a question that is that's died down at all. Yeah. So so this is again continuing on with the preface. It is suggested there cannot be the same life, the same brightness and beauty in relating the penitent part as is in the criminal part. If there is any truth in that suggestion, I must be allowed to say it is because there is not the same taste and relish in the reading, and indeed it is true that the difference lies not in the real worth of the subject as much as in the gust and palate of the reader. Yeah. So he also kind of shifts the responsibility for how the story is going to be received onto the reader. Yeah. And he says, It's also up to the reader. I mean, what the reader gets of it, right? But as this work is chiefly recommended to those who know how to read it, yeah. And then he says, look, I know you readers are like really smart people and so on. You know how to read it, and you know how to make good uses of it, which the story all along recommends to them. So it is to be hoped that such readers will be more pleased with the moral than the fable. Yeah. So he says, look, there's this long, like, about 80% of the book, yeah, is about this, as I said, exciting life of Moll and so on, for the lack of a better phrase. And this last, like, 20% is really the bit where she's repentant and so on and so forth. And she turns a new leaf and becomes this good woman, right? Yeah. And you will see also interestingly that the last 20%, that bit where she repents, is when she actually has her own plantation and she has her own land and she can actually breathe in peace and live a life of a good woman. And up until then, she's really had no choice. And that's the fact. Yeah. So we'll talk about that also. We'll talk about that as well. But this is how, sort of Defoe couches it. So he says it's to be hoped that such readers will be more pleased with the model than with the fable, with the application than with the relation, and with the end of the writer than with the life of the person written off. Yeah. Okay, so this is from chapter 1. But before we go to that, any questions?
I'm still surprised that after we've probably covered 100 years or so of the history of
Yeah.
the novel, more than that, and we're still
Yeah.
the, the writer of the novel is still concerned with like still values proposing or like convincing the reader that this is a true story. So
Yeah. Yeah, I
I'm
think, yeah. In fact, even after Defoe, you'll find Richardson and all the others. I mean, they're, see, you have to also think of it. There's a framework of the whole some two or three things, right? There is this whole way in which the figure of the individual you have, right, slowly sort of emerging. So individual as in somebody who's economically independent, right? They do their own thing. They don't do what their fathers or their mothers tell them to do. Look at Robinson Crusoe, right? You in the case of Moll Flanders, which is what, in my opinion, makes this far richer text than Robinson Crusoe. The protagonist is female, and she's a woman who's down and out on her luck. She's more or less an orphan, and she brings herself up, right? She has no early privilege, advantage, none of that, none of what the Robinson Crusoe had, for instance, right? So there is that. And so she has to make her way in the world, a world in which, for women, the only way to go up the ladder is via marriage to a man who is earning enough and a respectable man, right? So either you're this respectable wife of a respectable man, or you fall through those cracks and you end up becoming a petty thief or a prostitute, which is what sort of, Moll is constantly on the boundaries of this respectable wife, prostitute kind of a thing. So it's quite a dance that she does. Yeah. So there is that whole notion of the individual, and Moll is, this is a story. It's a kind of a coming of age story in its own way, right? Making of an individual, the individual called Moll Flanders, despite the very difficult circumstances of her birth. Yeah. So you have that. You also have, capitalism in the early form, sort of on the ascendant, and you have, and all that it enables, including the individualism that we've just talked about, right? So you have all that on the one hand, in a sense, yeah. And you have old-fashioned religion, and you have the church, you have the good old patriarchy, you have father figures, you have the notion of the solid, respectable family. None of that has gone, right? All that is there. So it's a very, very complex society at the time. Yeah, it continues to be. And so writers, I think, are doing what everybody else is doing. It's just that it comes out, I think, to us in terms of how they think about their work and present it to us. But for everybody, there is a pull, there's an inner pull between what they want to do, the kind of life they want to lead, and the fact that the church is telling you to do something else. The church is telling you, look, this is bad, that's good, this is okay to do, that's not okay to do, right? So on the one hand, for instance, in Moll's own life, if you think about it, there's no way for her to survive and become an individual other than by stealing. But stealing is robbery is a sin, right? According to the church, prostitution is a sin. Selling your body is a sin. So then, but what do you do, right? There is no other thing. So this this pull, I think, is the novel is a form that's kind of actually, I think, literally, it's the early novel is actually, um, um, I think, describing for us in many different ways that the contrariness of life, the contradictions, the paradoxes, the many different pulls and the conflicts that people at the time experience, right? And that's not going away. That's not going to go away in quite some time. So you will notice, even with Moll Flanders, you will notice that there is a way in which a conduct book, for instance, the genre of the conduct book, even in literature, right, influences the writing of Moll Flanders, right? Because you have to always have not just an eye on the market like that, which is something that Defoe does clearly, but also have an eye, because it's also an internal eye that you have on yourself. You're looking at yourself as a novelist, and you're writing writing out this life of a wicked woman or whatever. But there is a part of you uh, telling you that you need to you can't sort of really go against the church. You can't really go, you can't sort of commit a sin. You can't put out there a book that is that's going to sell bad morals to your readers. So I think Defoe is, yeah. So I think Defoe's also probably conflicted himself, right? Even as he's doing this. So on the one hand, yeah, I think he's playing a conscious game, but maybe not. Also, it's also that it's playing out. The conflict is playing out in himself as a writer, right? Yeah, so this is what I think. I mean, but yeah, any number of theories on this. Any other comments? So it's not, I think, just about being tentative, but which is there, of course, because it's a new form, blah blah blah. It's novel is a new form and all of that. But it's also that, and I think that hasn't really gone away. The fact that we all live conflicted lives is not. I mean, we all know Ramanujan's theory of a language that we speak outside the home, and a language that you speak inside the home, right? And that's true. I mean, we are sometimes, we find ourselves being one kind of person within the family and another kind of person outside of the family in the public sphere, right? So I think those contrary pulls is what they're trying to, but because the novel is new, I think early novelists also got into this whole thing of having these very elaborate prefaces, setting it up, and saying, maybe this is how you might want to read it. Please, like, don't think of it as a bad book. Yeah, it's about a bad woman, but she's penitent, and whatever, right? So I think there's all of that going on, I think, under the surface of this. Yeah, but if you read the book, I mean, you must. I'm really hoping you make an effort and read it. It's something else. I mean, what Moll does, and the kind of fierce independence that she shows, that she displays, is out there. Yeah, out there with the best feminist narratives that you will find, I think. Yeah, except it's of course couched in like, I'm sorry about that, and I had to do this, and all of that. Yeah, but and also all of these stories, right up to Pride and Prejudice, Austen and Dickens, there is a way in which I think all of literary texts are actually tied to the economic lives of the characters. I mean, this is their life, and they have to work against, in order to pull herself out of poverty, she has to do certain things, and that's a point that over and over and over again the text emphasizes. Yeah, so there's a very clear-eyed emphasis on the economic universe that she's part of. Yeah, and the working classes, and the divide is very, very clearly, and that you're never allowed to forget that. Yeah, I think a lot of the early English novels never allow you to forget the class question, and I find them interesting for that reason, because they're always coming back to it, and class, how class is related to issues of family and marriage, whom gets to marry whom, and what happens when you marry, right? Whom should you really be marrying, right? And why is marriage important at all? Yeah, when does it become marriage from just being romance and romantic love? Right, marriage itself is a very it's an institution of the church. It's about stability. It's about also economic stability and respectability. All those ideas are tied up together. No, it's not separate. So yeah, I think yeah. Any comments or questions? Okay, shall I move on? Yeah, can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is from chapter 1, and this is Moll speaking in Moll's voice. It's first person. Yeah, this is the other thing, Robinson Crusoe and thing. This is a first person perspective, right? My true name is so well known in the records or registers at Newgate, which is a prison, and in the Old Bailey, and there are some things of such consequence still depending there, relating to my particular conduct, that it is not to be expected I should set my name or the account of my family to this work. Yeah. So Moll tells you straight, the line 1, right? It's like Moll is sort of narrating the story to us. It's the true story of her own life. It's actually an autobiography, but she cannot reveal to us her name or details of her family, because there are lots of things of consequence, she says, that, and she sort of, it's a sort of like a little secret, and that she keeps from her readers. She says, I can't tell you, right? Perhaps after my death, it may be better known. At present, it would not be proper. No, not though a general pardon should be issued. Yeah, even if a general pardon is issued and all the prisoners of Newgate and Old Bailey are actually left, asked to leave prison and so on, are actually released from prison. Even then, it would not be proper for me to reveal names, because so much of what I have to say has to do with people and back there in those sort of criminal underbelly of England, so to speak. Yeah, and her true name is very, very well known, she says, in the registers and records at Newgate. Yeah, at present it would not be proper. No, not though a general pardon should be issued, even without exceptions and reserves of persons or crimes. It's enough to tell you that as some of my worst comrades who are out of the way of doing me harm, having gone out of the world by the steps and the string, and that's the noose, of course, they've all been sentenced to death, as I often expected to go, I knew me by the name of Moll Flanders. So you may give me leave to speak of myself under that name, till I dare own who I have been as well as who I am. Yeah. Okay. I have been told that in one of neighbor nations, whether it be in France or where else I know not, they have an order from the king that when any criminal is condemned either to die or to the galleys or to be transported, if they leave any children as such are generally unprovided for by the poverty or forfeiture of their parents, so they are immediately taken into the care of the government and put into a hospital called the House of Orphans, where they are bred up, clothed, fed, taught, and when fit to go out, are placed out to trades or to services, so as to be well able to provide for themselves by an honest, industrious behavior. Had this been the custom in our country, I had not been left a poor, desolate girl without friends, without clothes, without help or helper in the world, as was my fate, and by which I was not only exposed to very great distresses, even before I was capable either of understanding my case or how to amend it, but brought into a course of life which was not only scandalous in itself, but which in its ordinary course tended to the swift destruction both of soul and body. Yeah. So she says, look, it was not my fault. I mean, had it been like how it is, I hear it is like that in France and so on, that if you're orphaned and so on, you're brought up in a house for orphans, and you're supported till the time you can go out into the world and make your own way. Had that been the custom in our country, I would not have been poor and desolate as I was. Yeah, and I had no other choice but to do certain things. Yeah, but the case was otherwise here. My mother was convicted of a felony for a certain petty theft scarce worth naming. Yeah, and this is also the context, right? Actually, this is the truth of the time, that petty thefts were also, the punishment for that was very, very, very harsh, completely out of proportion to the nature of the theft. Yeah, scarce worth naming. That is, namely, having an opportunity of borrowing. Look at the word, sort of way in which he uses the word borrowing for stealing. Having an opportunity of borrowing 3 pieces of fine holland, it's a particular kind of fabric, of a certain draper in Cheapside. Yeah. So all her mother did was to steal 3 bits of fabric, right? And for that, she was actually convicted of felony. Yeah, and she was sent to prison. So Moll very clearly establishes the reasons why she was forced to turn to a life of crime. And you'll see that Dickens, if you read Great Expectations and and Oliver Twist, for instance, so the construction of a criminal kind of continues to fascinate novelists who come later. This is the other thing, right? So you have the good woman, the good bad man, the criminal. So the black and white thing is very, very much a part of the way in which it was seen. Yeah. So Moll's only defense on moral grounds, yeah, is this early defense of vulnerability by reason of birth and these social circumstances. Yeah. So she keeps bringing this up. She says, look, I couldn't, you can't hold me accountable for this, right? So this is again an excerpt from the text. She says, it will not be strange if I now began to think, but alas, it was but with very little solid reflection. I had a most unbounded stock of vanity and pride, and a very little stock of virtue. I did indeed case sometimes with myself what young master aimed at, but thought of nothing but the fine words and the gold. Whether he intended to marry me or not to marry me seemed a matter of no great consequence to me. Nor did my thoughts so much as suggest to me the necessity of making any capitulation for myself, till he came to make a kind of formal proposal to me, as you shall hear presently. Yeah. So she's giving us an account of her first suitor. And she talks about how, she is ruined or whatever. Thus, I gave up myself to a readiness of being ruined without the least concern, and am a fair memento to all young women whose vanity prevails over their virtue. Yeah. So this becomes another argument for the existence of a novel like Moll Flanders. She says, look, I am an example actually to all young women who may be very, very vain and for whom vanity prevails over virtue, right? Because look where it got me. Look at the bad place into which it sort of forced me, my vanity. Nothing was ever so stupid on both sides. Had I acted as became me and resisted as virtue and honor required, this gentleman had either desisted his attacks, this is a person who seduces her, right? Finding no room to expect the accomplishment of his design, or had made fair and honorable proposals of marriage. Yeah. And you will find echoes of this in Pamela, which we will discuss in a subsequent class, right? This whole thing of the trope of seduction, virtue, young women caving in and sort of being morally weak and caving in, and how that leads to eternal ruin and damnation. Yeah. In which case, whoever had blamed him, nobody could have blamed me. In short, if he had known me and how easy the trifle he aimed at was to be had, he would have troubled his head no further, but have given me 4 or 5 guineas and have lain with me the next time he had come at me. Yeah. So this is just to give you, let me just stop sharing. Yeah. Just to give you a little sense of, how where the text is headed. Any questions up until now? Yeah. Is everything clear?
Ma'am,
Yeah.
I have a question. I don't, it's like still forming in my mind a little bit. But do you think that Moll Flanders, with all its out of the box, ridiculous events which have too many coincidences, could it be a parody of the realist form of the novel itself? Just because people want to make it gritty, they've made it this gritty. Defoe has made it this gritty, this realistic, so realistic that it is almost unrealistic. That kind of thing.
I don't think so. I think there's not sufficient, not enough time for the realist form to take off for somebody like Defoe to even be hyper realistic or to even attempt a parody of it. So I don't think that that would be the case. I think what's happening here, the grittiness of it, that kind of attention to this to the underbelly of life in a sense, right? Really boils down to the fact that here are writers who are now waking up to the fact that it's all right to write, not just all right, but I think that it's the thing to do. And what we need to do is to really write about the common man, the common woman, right? And it's okay to have that their lives portrayed, their lives represented via fiction, even though, of course, it's not couched as fiction, it's couched as, in this case, as autobiography and so on and so forth, right? And yeah, even though, it's not clear at all. This is very likely just complete fiction anyway. Yeah. So I don't think I don't think that's really Defoe's thing at all.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So I think I mentioned to you sometime a few minutes ago about the conduct book, right? So actually, if you look at a form like the conduct book, the whole rationale is that social mobility is actually possible, right? And that's, according to them, is the, I mean, it's obviously good news, right? So if you're a woman down and out on your luck and really, you have no money, no fortune of your own, no dowry to give or whatever is the equivalent, right? And there is a dowry, by the way, in English society as well. Maybe it's come as news to you, but there is a concept of dowry, not in the way we understand it in the Indian context, but certainly some property that the woman owns and so on is always there, and it comes. I mean, and we'll talk about that also in the context of Jane Austen and other writers, right? So the thing is, in the conduct book genre, which is, I think, very important to understand before we come to a reading of even Moll, Flanders, and so on. The conduct book are basically books that offer advice to young women on how they should conduct themselves, and what skills they should pick up, and how they should carry themselves in the world, and so on, so that they can then be married to an eligible man, right? Somebody who will confer on her a degree of respectability, and that she can then move up in the world. Yeah. So the idea is really that by reading these conduct books, a young woman could then learn the requisite codes of sensibility, which would make her more attractive commodity of greater value on the marriage market. Yeah. And I think in India, we all instinctively understand, I don't have to explain to you why marriage is a market. It is a marketplace. Yeah. So as England moved from a hierarchical society, deeply hierarchical society, slowly it moved. It's not like overnight, suddenly, everything is great, but it's not that story at all. But there is a way in which there is a slight shift from that hierarchical society to a society where the middle classes at least begin to thrive. Yeah. So it's not just you have the aristocracy and then you have the peasantry, but you now have a middle class, right? So the social mobility as an idea actually becomes a possibility. Yeah. So women especially, where suddenly they found that it was possible for them to move up the social ladder in exchange for a dowry paid over to a man of aristocratic birth. Yeah. So, but conduct books were needed to give women an appropriate sense of how they should basically behave or conduct themselves, how they should think and feel and respond in this new whole sphere of social interaction. Very, very, it's far more complex than my camera is still off. Sorry. Yes, it's far more complex than it's actually quite a fascinating genre. So if you have a chance, in fact, somebody might want to even do a presentation on it if you like. So yeah, so it's quite complicated, right? So Moll Flanders is as you know, a complete nobody in social terms. Yeah. Her mother has actually been convicted of a crime, and she's on her own in life and so on. And her story can actually only takes place outside of the discourse of conduct books, right? She's not part of the genteel class. Yeah. And so if you think of the idea of life itself as a marketplace, and the world of the novel that we are talking about is a world in which human existence is defined by this basic struggle for survival, right? And I think as a result of this materialist orientation is that the individual human being is profoundly also isolated. Yeah, that's one of the tragedies of our lives anyway, right? So, and people are then reduced to mere experience. They just become, kind of pawns in a sense, right? So if you examine Moll's relationships, from one relationship to the other or whatever, right? Each of them, as I said, end quite abruptly and this is interesting, without any residual emotion. Yeah. So Moll doesn't there's hardly a time when she looks back between two relationships, right? When she moves from one man to the other. I mean, either because she is dumped by him or she decides to leave him or whatever, right? But there is no emotional carryover, right? And the novel, actually there are a lot of minor nameless characters in the novel, which are who are there basically to advance the plot, and then those characters are all left behind. So it's very episodic, it's very jerky, it just goes from one to the other to the other. Yeah. So as I said, not the best in terms of how he plots it. Yeah. So the spiritual side of human life, which Defoe, of course, it sort of talks about initially, and he says, it's actually about a bad woman, but there's a good moral and blah blah blah. But the spiritual side of human life is all but overshadowed by materialist concerns, and there is actually very little room in Defoe's vision, I think, for the idea that people might find ways to transcend their physical constraints or their material constraints. So Defoe acts really as a chronicler, as a historian almost of his era. And if you may recall from our previous class, his own personal background as a trader, as a merchant, right? He also had that short time when he was a merchant. And then, of course, a journalist. He did a number of different things. So that provides a lot of the material for Moll Flanders. And Moll Flanders is really a book in which everything has economic value. Everything, whether it's objects, situations, or people. Yeah. So Moll's personal attractions, I mean, she's a very beautiful young woman or whatever. That's a very, very valuable commodity when she's young. And as she grows older, the beauty begins to fade and she has to cash in on her cleverness, right? So her alternatives in life, I mean, are severely limited. And Defoe then has her, systematically, she explores all the available trades in order to, almost as though it's like to document the reality of each of these trades. Yeah, so that's why I said, I mean, you should really read it to get a sense. My summary does no justice to it. Yeah. So there are like maybe two main movements in, like, when it comes to the development of Moll's characters. The first is the process by which she kind of gets more and more sophisticated in the ways of the world, right? She learns by the obstacles that life throws in her way, how to handle herself so that she could minimize the extent to which she must depend on other people. So this development forms a large part of the novel, and it tends to lead Moll into ever greater degrees of vice. Yeah, so it's a spiral. Yeah, and Defoe also includes. There's also a, at the end of the story, there's a sort of a, like, as I told you already, sort of like a discontinuous turn where Moll repents of all her former wickedness and begins to live a reformed life, the life of a good reformed woman. Yeah. So this aspect of Moll's development is actually seems very, very unconvincing to me also, and to many other readers. They've commented on this, and it has very little effect in shaping the book as a whole. So the takeaway from Moll Flanders is not going to be that for any of us. I mean, I can give that to you in writing, right? So Moll's life is one with material consequences, not really ethical consequences. I think is very important. But of course, it has to be framed like an ethical story. There has to be a, like how as children you would have all read this, what's the moral of the story kind of a story, right? Yeah, so that kind of a thing. So what I'm saying is the vantage point of her later repentance is really not that convincing at all. I think it's not. So in some fundamental, so any questions till now? Okay, so at this, so one thing to remember is that even though, of course, I mean, despite the fact of her gender and what it leads her to do, Moll Flanders is very different from Robinson Crusoe. Fundamentally, they do share quite a few things. Yeah, so this is something to also remember. This whole drive to make good in the world. Yeah, whatever be the circumstances. Yeah, in Moll's case, she's out of luck from day one of her life, right? In Robinson Crusoe's case, actually, his father is willing to support him and to set him up in his career and all that, but his heart is elsewhere. He wants to go out, set sail, and so on. And so then he finds himself stranded in that island, and then therefore he's on his own. Yeah. So in the case of Moll Flanders, you have a protagonist, the heroine, who's a criminal, and also you have to remember the high incidence of crime is, it's also due to, I mean, there's the fierce competition of that kind of a early capitalist society, and so it's the way success is set up as economic success, and how that is not easily attainable for all. It's not equally available to everybody, right? So she is in so many ways, Moll Flanders is in so many ways a product of your modern individualism, because she almost, it's like as though she owes it to herself to achieve the highest economic social rewards, right? And uses every available method to carry out her resolve. Yeah. So like, I don't know, to just so when you say you try and get you enter the job market, for instance, right, or you are trying to get college admission. So typically what we all do is write every single exam out there. I mean, not everybody, most people do that and try their best to get into the best. You have a way in which you rank colleges in your head. You have a way in which you rank jobs in your head, right? So that's a market, and we are all aware of it. It is that, and it's really that at some level, right? And so that's where Moll is. Moll is also in this very, very large marketplace, and she has to compete. And what does she do? She has to use whatever available method to carry out her resolve. So it's actually rooted, like her crimes and Robinson Crusoe's travels are both rooted in the dynamic of economic individualism in a sense, right? And it's a bit different. You have to remember this. It's a bit different from the protagonist of Don Quixote, which is more a picaresque kind of novel. Because you see the Picaro, is not an individual personality. So they're basically literary conventions for certain, satiric observations or certain comic kind of episodes and things like that. Yeah. Whereas Defoe's characters are ordinary people who evoke our sympathy. Yeah. And when you look at somebody like Moll, you say, okay, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Right. This could have happened to me. It would have happened to any one of us. Right. So I think over and over again, that's what the reader feels. Like, had I been in her place, I would have done the same. Yeah. So Moll is, so that's the thing. So sort of just keep it in mind. So, and the other thing in this novel, and this will come up again in our discussion of Dickens, is that this whole exposure to law, which is a real and continuous thing, and punishment is the reality. It's not a convention. It's not about sin and therefore you're punished for it, but it's in the frame of crime and law within that frame also, right? So, it was also Moll Flanders was, remember that it was published at a time when there was a very well-defined criminal class and a very complex system for handling it. Yeah. So, if you look at Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right, which is actually a treatise about sin in some ways, grace, spiritual rewards, punishments, and all of that. It plays out completely within the realm of spirituality, right? It is sin and grace and punishment and reward and all of that. But within that, the religious, the spiritual framework, right? Whereas Moll Flanders, despite Defoe's claim to its, the whole thing of penitence and blah, 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 it's actually playing out within the framework of law and punishment and, that kind of thing, right? So, if you look at, I mean, few years, some centuries before, the writing of Moll Flanders, poverty was not so much a disgrace, but a route to salvation. So if you're poor, you're sort of blessed, and your path to grace is kind of, clearer, right? But by the 16th century, interestingly, poverty comes to be seen as shameful. It's a sign of failure. It's a sign of not managing to achieve something, right? So Defoe's heroes would rather steal than beg, right? And so this is it. So here you have the portrait of the economic individual. Yeah, no choice but to, because of the ideology of the time, no choice but to make good economically. Yeah. Okay, so it's very clear. So the individual's orientation to life is determined by their own in terms of their not in terms of their ethics really, yeah, but in terms of their compliance with or conflict with legal frameworks, legal authorities, and so on. So punishments for offenses against property is very, very severe at this time. Yeah. So she's, you remember that, she's, Moll Flanders is, both Moll and her mother, for petty crimes, they're almost sort of sent to the, hanged for their crimes very nearly. Yeah. So there is also a connection between the whole idea of economic individualism and, in the context of this particular story, the construction of the criminal and colonial development. Yeah. So there's a whole transport of, as you know, metropolitan criminals to North American plantations between 1717 and 1775. Yeah. So some of these criminals do well for themselves. They work very hard, and the story ends well. Yeah. So economic success literally triumphs over the moral universe, and all can be forgiven if the former criminal just repents. But the repentance plays out in particular ways. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah. I feel, okay, let me, 1 minute. Okay, I feel Moll's story has a close resemblance to The Wife of Bath's Tale and Canterbury Tales. Both of them are prototypical. Yeah, I was going to come to that. Yeah, who are ostracized for their multiple husbands, vices, and how they carry themselves You're absolutely right. So, in fact, I'm going to sort of talk about that very, very briefly now. Any other comments? Yeah. Okay. So, in fact, I was just sort of going to come to that. That the reading of Moll Flanders as a proto-feminist text. I think what strikes us most about her as a female protagonist are her intelligence, her practical. She's very competent. She's very high functioning, right? Her self-sufficiency, and the ways in which she defies conventional feminine roles and so on. Yeah. So she's persevering. She never gives up. She's adaptable, and she sort of triumphs over every curveball that life throws at her. She dominates every situation. And given the patriarchal society it is, she has to depend on men for security, but never more than she has to, right? And her dependency is also quite an active kind of a thing. It's not. So she uses men in a way as tools. She's fairly manipulative that way. She uses men as tools wherever possible, seeks to maximize her own opportunity for self-reliance. Yeah. So it is really in the lowest stratum of society, when she's like working class and down and out, that Moll is at her freest, and where her activity almost is like an art. Yeah. And she's completely confident in that world, and it's actually quite charming, at that point. Yeah. So this is one thing. And also in terms of Defoe is, I think, very alive to the fact that to the kind of conflict in the fact that the arenas where Moll might hope to use her many talents and provide for herself are all morally dubious. Yeah, she can be a thief, she can be a prostitute, she can be a husband seeker, literally a gold digger, whatever, right? So Moll's, has this, let's call it a flexible moral code, and it's designed to accommodate this conflict as much as possible. Yeah, so this is, so it's actually linked. I mean, this questionable morality, and it's actually linked to this whole other set of conflicts and so on, and also the dilemmas as a woman in terms of where you are as in terms of the larger issues of society. What do you do to make a living, right? So I think this is something that we should always keep in mind. Yeah. So the fact that the novel is very episodic, and that suddenly towards the end there's this rapid like repentance thing coming in and so on. It's almost as though Defoe did not plan his novel as a coherent whole, but that he perhaps worked piecemeal. Yeah. So in terms of crafting, that's the sense we get, right? He worked piecemeal, maybe very rapidly, without too much of revision, right? And really, as a writer, one of his aims was to achieve a large output. Yeah. And not really maybe meant for a careful critical audience. It's not terribly fastidious. Not it was not that kind of a thing. Yeah. So this is very clear. So his novels actually employ two sorts of methods for reporting. One is a relatively full scenic presentation, where at a definite time and place the doings of the characters are reported more or less fully, and the passages of barer, less detailed summary which set the stage and provide a necessary framework connecting everything. Yeah. So most novelists would have perhaps reduced the summarizing and focused on realizing a few scenes, but Defoe's method is far more patchwork. Yeah, he, large portions of the text are actually devoted to summarizing. Right, he's sort of this huge chunks of that. Yeah, so it's a fairly primitive narrative technique if you think about it, and Defoe's literary purpose is very, very basic, I think, and I think his whole thing was to produce maybe a convincing likeness to the form of the autobiography of a real person. Yeah, so that's what he actually wanted to do, right? So so there are also other kind of, for the lack of a better word, flaws in the novel. So for instance, Moll's outpouring of emotion when she sees her son is almost incongruous, right, with because she's actually very unsentimental about she's lost a number of children, which is something I forgot to mention, but in her life, because she moves on and so on, right? But she's completely unsentimental about the fact that she has lost all those children. Yeah, and so this almost seems very, very incongruous and things like that. And it is, of course, like almost like that sentiment would be a luxury for somebody like Moll. Yeah, because she doesn't have security, she doesn't have prosperity almost till the very end. Yeah, and it's that she can't actually afford to display those emotions. Yeah. So her new, that filial piety or whatever, right, is also in keeping with her religious conversion, like how she becomes this good woman, and the fact that her outlook has really changed, and it's like almost supposedly proof of that. Yeah. So the fact that she does not hesitate to tell a whole lot of lies, whole web of lies to protect herself and promote her own convenience is, and it makes you kind of doubt uh, this image of Moll as a reformed woman and her eagerness to retrieve her share of her mother's legacy, right? So this is one thing. I mean, you're wondering, where is this woman coming from? Yeah. So there's a lot of debate on this, the questionable sincerity of Moll's reformation by the end of the novel. Is it a real repentance? Is the question. Yeah. So it's because the way fond, happy manner in which she relates her past life suggests otherwise. Yes, there are a lot of novels like this, which there is where there is an internal tension, and you have to read the tension for what it really reveals to us. Yes, very very important. Yeah, where is it that the novelist really wants you to dwell on? What does he want you to entertain you with? Yeah, is a question that you might want to always keep in mind. Yeah, so that's I think I'll kind of stop here. It's almost time. But any questions? Let me stop the recording then. Yeah, anybody has questions?
Going back to hello, am I audible?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Going back to what I mean, Moll's whole rise up the socioeconomic ladder. How do you think what I mean? I'm assuming that FO didn't come from a very uh, commoner's sort of background, or like at least as impoverished as the characters he is describing here. So, what do you think? Like his view of, is he sympathetic towards the impoverished or the commoners, or is he what? Because when he's describing this act of breaking out of this condition of
Yeah,
not being rich or not having well enough means,
yeah.
is he like, does he think of that as an immoral act because she's repenting at the end? And how does that compare to something like Dickens when he is describing the impoverished or
Yeah, yeah. My reading of this is that I don't think Defoe is at all judgmental about Moll, or I think on the whole, I think what his greatest impetus as a storyteller in this case is to tell us, to give us this whole thing of the life of a woman who, I mean, she has to do X, Y, Z things in order to survive. That's the point of the novel, actually, I think, which Defoe wants to, that's the lesson he wants us to take away. But he can't sort of say it and leave it there. He has to tell us, or he has to tell his readers, or whoever he thinks are going to judge him, that look, the takeaway for you is that there is a moral there, because she repents. She does all these bad things, but she repents. But that's the tension. I think to me that makes it very interesting. I mean, that's how I'm reading it. It's my reading, really. I think he's. I don't think I don't think it's a case of his being actually, sort of personally even voyeuristic or even judgmental or saying, "Oh, look at this terrible, terrible woman," or any of that. He's just chronicling it, and he's saying, "Look, this is what poverty does to people, and this is how Moll Flanders has survived and triumphed." Right, and what makes her an interesting character, and you must all read about her life. Yeah, and I think had he been a writer writing in a later era, he would have left it at that. But the whole preface and all of that he tries to do to sort of explain away this the need for a story like this to be out in the public sphere is something else, I think. Yeah. That's really my reading. I think that there's an inherent tension between where Defoe would actually like you to focus, which is what he ends up, 80% of the novel really is about Moll living this very, I don't know, fascinating life in a way. Yeah. And just that little bit of that repentance and so on, which yeah, like to say I followed the rules or whatever, I've repented now, and so I think this is Defoe telling us I'm following the rules of society, and and it is not a bad book for you all to be reading. Yeah, any other questions? Okay, so I'll yeah, it's a long thing. Okay, so we'll Yeah. So, okay, about the presentations, Aditya, please share the doc with me later. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Just hours.
Okay. Then I'll see you all tomorrow.